Alexander the Great is remembered as a hero, a young king who conquered the known world, a military genius, a leader who, according to history, respected the cultures he defeated. Many books describe him as different from other conquerors, more refined, more understanding. They say he did not destroy Persian traditions. They say he honored Persian royalty. They say he showed mercy. But these stories usually stop at the battlefield. They rarely follow what happened after the palaces fell. And they almost never focus on one group whose fate was quietly decided behind closed doors. Persian princesses. When Alexander defeated the Persian Empire, he did not just conquer land, he captured power. And in ancient empires, power did not live only in armies or cities. It lived in bloodlines. Persian royal women were not ordinary figures. They were symbols of legitimacy. Princesses represented continuity. They represented dynasties that had ruled for generations. Through them, alliances were formed. Through them, power was passed on. They mattered. And because they mattered, their fate was never left to chance. When Persian cities fell, the royal court collapsed quickly. Palaces that had once been places of ceremony became places of silence. Guards disappeared, servants fled, rituals ended overnight. Royal women who had lived surrounded by structure suddenly had none. They were not killed. They were not publicly harmed, but they were captured. And capture does not always mean chains. Alexander understood something his enemies often underestimated. Killing royal women would create martyrs, but controlling them would secure authority. So instead of violence, he chose management. Instead of destruction, he chose absorption. And that choice changed everything. Persian princesses were placed under protection. That word sounds gentle, even kind, but protection also means control. They could not leave. They could not decide their future. They could not speak freely. Their safety came with conditions. Alexander's army watched this carefully. Many of his soldiers expected conquest to follow familiar rules: loot, punishment, clear winners and losers. But what they saw was different. The royal women were treated with respect on the surface. Their titles were acknowledged. Their status appeared intact. Yet their freedom was gone. This confused Alexander's own men. They were warriors raised in a culture that believed victory meant dominance. What they witnessed instead was restraint mixed with calculation. Not rage, not mercy, strategy. Persian princesses were kept visible, but powerless. They were displayed as proof that the old empire had fallen, and that its bloodline now existed under Macedonian control. They became living symbols of conquest. Alexander did not erase Persian royalty. He repurposed it. Publicly, this was described as honor. Privately, it was policy. Royal women were moved, watched, and guided into roles they did not choose. Every movement was supervised. Every appearance planned. They were no longer individuals. They were assets. This treatment unsettled many Macedonian soldiers. They were used to seeing conquered elites punished or eliminated. What Alexander did felt quieter. And quiet control can be more disturbing than open cruelty. Alexander's closest officers understood the message. The Persian Empire was not just defeated, it was being absorbed. And royal women were central to that process. Through them, Alexander could present himself not only as a conqueror, but as a rightful successor. This shift blurred the line between victor and ruler. Alexander did not want to stand above Persia. He wanted to stand inside it, and Persian princesses made that possible. Their royal blood carried legitimacy. By keeping them alive and visible, Alexander signaled continuity. The empire had changed hands, but it had not ended. At least that was the message. But for the women involved, this continuity came at a cost. Their identities were preserved only in name. Their choices were removed. They were expected to adapt quickly, to accept new customs, new authority, new expectations. Resistance was not allowed, not openly, not quietly. Alexander's approach was praised by historians. They wrote of restraint, of civilization. They contrasted his actions with the brutality of other conquerors. But praise often ignores perspective, especially the perspective of those who had no voice. Persian princesses did not choose to represent peace. They were assigned that role. The silence surrounding their fate is not accidental. It is convenient. Alexander's men felt this tension. Some admired his intelligence. Others were unsettled by it. They had conquered cities with force, but now they were watching power shift through ceremony, through marriages, through appearances, through women who could not refuse. This was not chaos. It was control with a calm face. And calm control is harder to question. At this stage, the true consequences were still unfolding. The princesses were alive, they were dressed well, they were spoken of respectfully. From the outside, it looked like mercy, but mercy without choice is something else entirely. The decisions made here would shape what came next. Not only for Persian royalty, but for how Alexander would rule his growing empire. After the initial capture, the situation of Persian princesses did not become clearer. It became more controlled. They were alive. They were housed. They were spoken of with respect. But none of these things meant freedom. The word most often used to describe their situation was protection. Protection sounds safe. It sounds generous. But protection also means supervision. And supervision means limits. Royal women were kept under constant watch, not with chains, not with force, with rules. They could not travel freely. They could not choose where to live. They could not decide who they would speak to. Every decision was made for them. On the surface, nothing looked cruel. They wore fine clothing. They lived in guarded quarters. They were treated as important figures. But importance did not give them control. It took it away. Alexander's strategy depended on appearances. He needed the conquered population to see continuity. He needed stability. Royal women made that possible. By keeping Persian princesses visible, Alexander sent a clear message. The old empire had not been destroyed. It had been absorbed. This absorption required symbols. Ceremonies replaced battles. Public appearances replaced executions. And royal women stood at the center of this display. They were used to legitimize authority. Their presence suggested acceptance. Their silence suggested agreement. But silence does not always mean consent. The princesses did not choose to represent unity. They were assigned that role. Marriage became one of the strongest tools. Not romance, not partnership, politics. These unions were not arranged for personal happiness. They were designed to bind cultures, to mix bloodlines, to remove the possibility of future resistance. Choice was not part of the process. Royal women were expected to comply. Refusal was not an option, not openly, not privately. To the outside world, this was described as diplomacy. To historians, it looked civilized. But civilization does not erase power imbalance. It hides it. Alexander's soldiers continued to watch with unease. They were warriors trained to expect clear outcomes, victory or defeat, life or death. What they saw instead was control without violence, and that disturbed them. In their culture, conquest was direct. Here, it was quiet. Some officers questioned this approach, not because it was kind, but because it was unfamiliar. They wondered where force had gone, and what replaced it. What replaced it was something more lasting: control over identity. Persian princesses were expected to adopt new customs, new languages, new appearances. Slowly, visibly, their original identity was softened, not erased in one moment, but reshaped over time. This process did not require brutality. It required patience. The women involved were expected to smile in public, to appear calm, to represent harmony. Their inner thoughts did not matter. Only the image did. They became part of Alexander's narrative, a story of unity, of tolerance, of enlightened rule, but enlightened rule still ruled. The princesses could not return to their old lives. Their former world no longer existed. Even if it did, they were not allowed back into it. Their value was now tied to how well they fit into the new order. Compliance became survival. The longer this system continued, the harder it became to escape. Visibility meant safety, but it also meant being watched. Alexander's approach was effective. Resistance faded. The conquered population adjusted, and royal women became quiet bridges between cultures. But bridges are not asked if they want to be crossed. Over time, their personal stories disappeared. Records mentioned names, but not voices. They were referenced, not heard. This silence benefited the victor. It made control look peaceful. It made domination look cooperative. Alexander's legacy grew stronger. His image as a fair ruler spread. But fairness depends on perspective. From the viewpoint of power, the system worked. From the viewpoint of the women involved, options vanished. They survived. But survival is not the same as choice. At this stage, the consequences were not yet visible to everyone. The system appeared stable. The empire appeared unified, but long-term effects were still developing. The decisions made here would shape not only individual lives, but how history remembered this conquest. And the way it would be remembered mattered more than what actually happened. For the Persian princesses, life did not return to normal. It could not. The world they had known no longer existed. And the world they now lived in was not their choice. They survived. But survival came with limits. In the years that followed the conquest, these women lived carefully managed lives. They were not prisoners in the traditional sense. They were not locked away, but they were never free. Every role they played was decided in advance. They were expected to represent harmony between conqueror and conquered. Their presence reassured the empire. Their silence maintained stability. But stability came at the cost of identity. Royal blood still flowed through them, but royal power did not. They carried names, not authority. Over time, their personal stories faded. They were mentioned in records only when useful, when they served political purpose, when they helped explain legitimacy, what they felt, what they lost, what they endured. These things were not written down. This absence was not accidental. History often records what strengthens power and forgets what complicates it. By presenting the conquest as controlled and civilized, later writers protected the image of the conqueror. They praised restraint. They admired intelligence. They framed domination as cooperation. But cooperation requires choice, and choice was never offered. The system worked because it did not rely on constant force. It relied on adjustment. Over time, adjustment became habit. Habit became normal. Generations grew up accepting the story as it was told. Alexander became a symbol of enlightened rule. Persia became a chapter that closed peacefully. The princesses became footnotes. Their lives continued, but always within boundaries. They could adapt, but not decide. They could exist, but not lead. Marriage, residence, public behavior, all controlled. Their value was measured by how well they fit the narrative. This kind of control leaves no visible scars, no ruins, no mass graves, only silence. Silence is easy to misunderstand. It looks like peace, but peace without freedom is fragile. As time passed, memory softened. What began as strategy became tradition. What began as control became culture. The original purpose was forgotten. Only the result remained. Alexander's image grew larger with every retelling. He was remembered as a hero who respected those he conquered. His empire became a model, his methods admired. But admiration depends on distance, and distance hides cost. The Persian princesses paid that cost quietly. They did not resist publicly. They did not leave records. They did not shape how their story would be told. Their fate was decided by others, and then described by others. This is why their story feels incomplete, because it was never meant to be complete. The absence of violence made everything easier to justify. There were no executions to condemn, no visible cruelty to question, only decisions. And decisions are harder to challenge when they appear reasonable. Alexander did not need fear alone to rule. He needed acceptance, and acceptance is easier to manufacture than loyalty. The princesses became part of that manufacture, symbols of unity, proof of restraint. But symbols do not speak. When we look back today, we often ask if Alexander was kind or cruel, if he was tolerant or ruthless. But those questions miss something important. Power does not need cruelty to dominate. Sometimes it only needs silence. The story of the Persian princesses reminds us of this. That control can wear the mask of mercy. That domination can look calm. That survival does not always mean freedom. They lived long lives, but not full ones. Their fate did not end with conquest. It stretched forward, quietly shaping how history would remember the past, and that memory favored the victor. Only now, when we slow down and look closer, does the pattern become clear. What was praised as restraint was also removal. What was called unity was also control. The princesses were not destroyed. They were absorbed, and absorption erased them just as effectively. This is why their story matters, because it challenges the version of history we are comfortable with. It reminds us that power is not only measured in battles, but in who is allowed to choose and who is not. Alexander's empire rose quickly. His victories were celebrated, his image carefully preserved. But for the Persian princesses, conquest did not end with defeat. It followed them into silence, into history, and into a story that was never meant to be told.